Hey guys, tonight we're taking a gentle journey back in time. Not to the clatter of horse-drawn carriages or the smoky streets of industrial cities, but to something much more refined, much more serene. Imagine, if you will, the hushed elegance of a Victorian drawing room, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, the delicate clink of porcelain, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed tea. But beneath this tranquil surface lay a labyrinth of unspoken rules, strict expectations, and subtle social codes. You probably won't survive a single Victorian tea party without committing at least 3 egregious social blunders, let alone actually enjoying the cucumber sandwiches. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, maybe let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine us all drifting off together across different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the heart of Victorian England, an era defined by propriety, rigid social structures, and an almost obsessive attention to etiquette. And at the very center of much of this social choreography was tea. Not just a beverage, mind you, but an institution, a ritual, and a profound symbol of domesticity, refinement, and social standing. Tea had made its way to England centuries before, but it was during the Victorian era, under the long reign of Queen Victoria, that it truly became a national obsession, transforming from a costly, exotic import into a daily necessity and a social cornerstone. Think about the sheer ubiquity of tea. It wasn't merely something you drank at a specific time. It punctuated the entire day. There was early morning tea, often brought to your bedside. Then breakfast tea, a stronger brew to start the day. Later, a mid-morning elevences, and of course, our focus tonight, afternoon tea, a refined social gathering. Finally, high tea for working families, a more substantial evening meal. It's almost as if the Victorians designed their entire schedule around their caffeinated beverages. You could practically hear them saying, "Time for tea. Oh, wait, no, it's just a quarter past the last tea. Still, almost time for the next tea." This widespread adoption of tea wasn't accidental. Several factors converged to make it so central. Firstly, improvements in transport and trade routes, particularly with India and Ceylon, made tea more accessible and affordable, although still a luxury for many. The British East India Company played a monumental role in this, effectively creating a tea empire. Secondly, the burgeoning British Empire meant a constant supply. Thirdly, the Victorians' emphasis on domesticity and home life made tea, a beverage enjoyed within the home, a perfect fit for their cultural values. It was a wholesome alternative to alcohol for social gatherings, promoting sobriety and polite conversation. For many Victorians, the simple act of brewing and drinking tea was a moment of quiet ritual, a pause in the often harsh realities of industrial life. It offered comfort, warmth, and a sense of routine. But for the middle and upper classes, tea evolved into something much more formal: the afternoon tea party. This wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about demonstrating one's refinement, adhering to intricate social rules, and subtly navigating the complex hierarchies of Victorian society. It was less about the tea and more about the unspoken rules surrounding the tea. You wouldn't want to sip your tea incorrectly, lest you be forever branded a social pariah. The teawares themselves became objects of immense beauty and status. Porcelain tea sets, often imported from China or meticulously crafted by British potteries like Wedgwood or Spode, were proudly displayed. Delicate teacups, saucers, teapots, sugar bowls, and milk jugs, often adorned with intricate patterns and gilding, were essential. Holding a teacup correctly, without hooking your finger through the handle, for instance, or allowing your pinky to splay out too dramatically, was a subtle test of one's upbringing. You literally had to hold it just so, or risk social ruin. Historians still argue whether some of these extreme etiquette rules were universally applied or more aspirational for the lower middle classes trying to keep up with the Joneses. The rise of tea also had broader social implications. It provided a structured, respectable setting for men and women to socialize outside of balls or formal dinners. It allowed for polite conversation, the exchange of gossip, and the subtle maneuvering of social standing. A well-executed tea party could elevate a hostess's reputation, while a single faux pas could lead to whispers and social decline. It was a minefield of manners, disguised as a delightful afternoon gathering. So, as you slowly drift into the gentle hum of the night, imagine that first delicate sip of Victorian tea. Feel the warmth of the cup, smell the rich aroma, and remember that behind every seemingly simple gesture lay a complex web of tradition, expectation, and unspoken rules. Tonight, we're pouring ourselves into that world, one meticulously measured drop at a time, to understand the surprisingly strict rules that governed every aspect of the Victorian tea party. It's a journey into a bygone era where even a biscuit could hold social significance. You've just had your first sip of Victorian tea, metaphorically speaking, and are now aware of its profound significance in daily life. Now, let's pinpoint the very moment this quintessential Victorian ritual truly began to take shape, exploring the almost accidental afternoon tea's genesis. It all started with a rumbling stomach and a rather clever duchess. Imagine the mid-1840s. The Duchess of Bedford, Anna Maria Russell, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria herself, found herself facing a particularly vexing problem. The traditional eating pattern of the upper classes involved a light breakfast, a very late dinner, and virtually nothing in between. This left a rather long, empty, and frankly, quite uncomfortable gap in the afternoon. Around 4 p.m., Anna would invariably experience what we might call a serious case of the hangries. She was, by all accounts, quite peckish. Oh heavens, she might sigh dramatically, fanning herself. I do believe I might simply perish from lack of sustenance before dinner. Her solution was delightfully simple, yet revolutionary. She began to request a tray of tea, along with a few light refreshments, perhaps some bread and butter, or a slice of cake, to be brought to her private rooms in the late afternoon. This private snack became her daily ritual, a much-needed bridge between luncheon and dinner. It was less about formal entertaining at first, and more about personal survival. One simply cannot endure until 9 o'clock without a small fortification, can one? Initially, this was a solitary affair, a private indulgence. But soon, the Duchess began to invite close friends to join her. Word spread. The idea of a light, elegant repast in the late afternoon, accompanied by the comforting warmth of tea, quickly caught on among her aristocratic circle. It offered a pleasant way to fill the long afternoon hours, providing a respectable and gentle setting for conversation and social interaction. distinct from the more formal dinners and evening entertainments. It was the original coffee break, but with more corsets and delicate porcelain. This accidental invention, born out of hunger and a need for a civilized pause in the day, quickly spread through London's high society. The concept of afternoon tea became firmly established as a distinct social occasion. It was polite, fashionable, and provided a structured way to entertain guests without the immense effort and expense of a dinner party. It offered a more informal, yet still strictly regulated, environment for social calls. Historians still argue whether the Duchess of Bedford was truly the sole originator, or if similar practices were already emerging, but she certainly popularized and formalized it for the upper echelons of society. The rising popularity of afternoon tea also coincided with the growing availability of tea itself, as we discussed. As tea became more affordable, the practice trickled down through the social classes, adapting to different means and customs. The middle classes eagerly adopted afternoon tea as a way to emulate the aristocracy and signal their own refinement and upward mobility. It became a democratic luxury within reach for many, even if their tea sets weren't quite as grand or their parlors as spacious as the Duchess's. This genesis of afternoon tea was crucial because it formalized the time, the setting, and the accompanying fare. It wasn't just a drink, it became a meal in miniature, a curated experience. The specific foods associated with afternoon tea, delicate finger sandwiches, scones with jam and clotted cream, and an array of small cakes and pastries, evolved alongside the ritual itself. These foods were designed to be eaten elegantly, without fuss, and to complement the tea perfectly. You couldn't just serve any old biscuit. It had to be the right kind of biscuit. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, picture the elegant Duchess, perhaps with a slight grumble in her stomach, inadvertently shaping an entire national tradition. It's a charming origin story for a ritual that would define an era, and it reminds us that sometimes the most enduring social customs arise from the simplest, most human needs. The next time you enjoy a cup of tea in the afternoon, remember Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, and her brilliant solution to the unbearable emptiness of the pre-dinner hours. She truly saved countless Victorians from the perils of being hangry. You've just discovered the delightful yet practical origins of afternoon tea, born from a duchess's afternoon hunger. Now, let's move from the invention to the initiation, delving into the incredibly precise and often unspoken rules of the invitation protocol. In Victorian society, the simple act of inviting someone to tea or being invited was a delicate dance of etiquette, subtle signals, and strict expectations. Imagine yourself as a Victorian lady, perhaps a new arrival in London society, eager to make connections and establish your social standing. Your success or failure could hinge on something as seemingly trivial as a piece of paper. The tea invitation. This wasn't a casual text message or a quick phone call. Oh no, this was a formal communication, steeped in tradition and loaded with unspoken meaning. First, let's talk about sending an invitation. A proper Victorian tea invitation was typically a small card, often engraved, or a note written on high-quality stationery. It would state the hostess's name, the date and time of the tea party, and sometimes the type of tea. The phrasing was always formal and concise. There were no emojis, no exclamation points, and certainly no RSVP, ASAP. It was all about understated elegance and clear, polite instruction. You wouldn't want to seem too eager, would you? That would be dreadfully uncouth. The delivery method was also crucial. Invitations were almost always hand-delivered by a servant or sent by post, but never, ever casually mentioned in passing or shouted across a crowded room. The act of delivery itself was part of the formality, a silent signal of the invitation's importance. Imagine a footman, impeccably dressed, presenting a small, sealed envelope with a flourish. It was a miniature diplomatic mission, just for tea. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. The at-home card. This was a common form of invitation, particularly for regular, less formal afternoon teas. An at-home card would simply state the hostess's name and address, followed by at home and a series of dates and times, perhaps Thursdays in October, 4 to 6 p.m. This wasn't an invitation to a specific party. It was an open invitation to call on the hostess during those designated hours. It was a subtle way of saying, I am available to receive callers, and tea will be served. It put the onus on the guest to decide when or if they would attend. It was like a standing open house, but with much more judgment involved. The wording of the invitation also subtly conveyed the formality of the event. A simple tea might imply a more casual gathering of close friends, while afternoon tea or high tea suggested a more structured affair. A printed card indicated greater formality than a handwritten note. Every detail, from the font to the paper quality, whispered volumes about the hostess's social standing and the nature of the event. It was a semiotics of social climbing, all on a tiny piece of cardstock. Now, let's turn to receiving an invitation. This was where the guest's etiquette truly came into play. The most important rule: respond promptly. Delaying your reply was a grave insult, suggesting indifference or a lack of respect for the hostess. A reply should be sent within a day or two, never more than 3. It was like the ancient equivalent of leaving someone unread, utterly rude. The form of the reply was equally strict. If the invitation was a formal, engraved card, the reply should also be a formal, handwritten note on quality stationery, mirroring the formality of the invitation. It would politely accept or decline, always expressing regret if declining. There was no need for lengthy explanations for declining. A simple regrets that she is unable to accept was perfectly sufficient. Over-explaining was seen as vulgar. Oh, I simply cannot attend, as my pet parrot has developed a cough, and I must administer his daily dose of medicinal brandy. Such a pity. No, no, no. Just a polite, unable to accept. If the invitation was an at-home card, the response protocol was different. You didn't necessarily send a formal reply. Instead, your attendance served as your response. However, if you were calling, you would leave your calling card with the servant upon arrival. If the hostess was not at home, you would simply leave your card, signifying that you had paid your respects. It was a subtle, almost theatrical way of managing social interactions. Historians still argue about the precise nuances of at-home cards and how much social pressure they exerted on guests to attend. A crucial, yet quirky, fringe tidbit. The turning down of a corner of a calling card could convey specific messages. For instance, folding down the top right corner might indicate a personal visit, while folding the top left could mean a visit of condolence. This subtle code allowed for communication without a single word being spoken. It was a secret language of paper, understood only by those in the know. Imagine accidentally folding the wrong corner and inadvertently insulting your hostess. The horror. Another unspoken rule. Never, ever bring an uninvited guest to a tea party. Victorian society was meticulously structured, and the guest list was carefully curated. Arriving with an unexpected companion was a social catastrophe, putting the hostess in an incredibly awkward position. It was like showing up to a dinner party with your entire extended family. Utterly unacceptable. The invitation protocol also served as a filter for social circles. Being invited to a tea party by a prominent hostess was a sign of acceptance and social validation. Not receiving an invitation or having your invitation declined could be a subtle snub, a quiet message that you were not quite in. It was a gentle, yet firm, way of reinforcing social boundaries and hierarchies. It was a system designed to keep everyone in their proper place, even if that place was just a seat at the tea table. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, picture the delicate dance of invitations and replies, the unspoken rules, and the subtle signals that governed Victorian social life. The seemingly simple act of inviting someone to tea was, in fact, a complex ritual, a testament to an era obsessed with propriety and social order. It reminds us that even the most charming social customs can hide a surprisingly strict and intricate web of expectations. And now, perhaps, you'll think twice before just showing up unannounced for tea. You've just navigated the intricate world of Victorian tea invitations, understanding that even a small card held immense social weight. Now, let's move from the written word to the visual statement. Exploring dressing for the occasion and the specific attire required for different types of Victorian tea. Because in an era obsessed with appearances, your clothing was a powerful, silent declaration of respect for your hostess and the event. Imagine yourself as a Victorian guest, having just sent your impeccably worded acceptance. Now comes the crucial question: what to wear? This wasn't a casual decision. Every stitch, every accessory, every hair ornament spoke volumes about your understanding of etiquette and your social standing. Making the wrong choice could be a subtle, yet devastating, faux pas. You wouldn't want to show up in your morning dress for an afternoon affair, would you? The very thought is enough to send shivers down a proper Victorian lady's spine. The general rule for an afternoon tea, particularly a formal one, leaned towards day dress rather than evening wear. For ladies, this typically meant a graceful, modest gown, often made of silk, fine cotton, or lightweight wool. Colors were generally subdued or pastel. Think soft blues, lavenders, creams, or subtle floral patterns. Heavy jewelry was usually avoided. Delicate pieces, like a small brooch, a cameo, or simple pearl earrings, were more appropriate. Gloves were almost always worn, though removed for eating, and a small hat or bonnet, adorned with ribbons, flowers, or feathers, was essential, unless it was an at-home where the hostess was receiving informal calls. It was about understated elegance, not dazzling display. You wanted to look charming, not like you were trying too hard, which was arguably trying even harder. For gentlemen, the attire for afternoon tea was typically a frock coat or a morning coat, paired with dark trousers, a waistcoat, and a cravat or tie. A top hat might be carried but not worn indoors. Gloves were also worn. The overall look was one of respectable formality, indicating that one was prepared for social interaction. but not for a grand evening affair. Imagine a group of gentlemen, all looking remarkably similar in their dark, tailored suits, like a flock of very well-dressed penguins. It was all about blending in perfectly, impeccably. Now, here's where the strict rules truly come into play. The distinction between different types of tea gatherings. A casual, impromptu tea among close family might allow for slightly less formal day wear, but a formal afternoon tea with a curated guest list demanded adherence to the highest standards. A high tea, on the other hand, often a more substantial meal served in the early evening, was generally a more informal affair, particularly for working class and lower middle class families. For these, everyday clothes were acceptable, as it was less a social event and more a practical family meal. However, even here, neatness and cleanliness were paramount. You might not wear your best silk, but you certainly wouldn't wear your muddy gardening clothes. Historians still argue about the precise social nuances between afternoon tea and high tea, as the terms sometimes overlapped or varied regionally. The season also played a role in dress codes. In summer, lighter fabrics like muslin or linen might be acceptable for outdoor garden tea parties, paired with parasols for ladies to protect their delicate complexions from the sun. In winter, heavier silks, velvets, or wools were worn, often with warmer shawls or wraps. It was a constant negotiation between fashion, formality, and the fickle British weather. You wouldn't want to shiver through your tea party, would you? That would distract from your perfect posture. Accessories were also important. Lace handkerchiefs, small reticules, and perhaps a small fan for a lady were common. For gentlemen, a watch chain, a tasteful tie pin, or a carefully folded pocket square could add a touch of personal flair without breaking the rules of decorum. Every item was chosen with purpose, intended to complement the overall look of refined respectability. It was a symphony of subtle details, played out on the stage of Victorian fashion. A quirky, fringe tidbit. Sometimes, guests would bring a small, delicate fan, not just for cooling, but as a silent communication device. The way a fan was held, opened, or closed could convey a host of unspoken messages, from "I am interested" to "you are rude." Imagine the silent drama unfolding across a drawing room, all communicated through the flutter of a lace fan. It was a secret language, mastered by the most astute socialites. The rules around dress reflected the Victorian emphasis on social order and the importance of presenting a respectable image. Your clothing was not merely a personal choice. It was a uniform that signaled your understanding of and adherence to society's expectations. To dress inappropriately was to reveal your ignorance, or worse, your disregard for the very foundations of polite society. It was a constant, subtle test, and only the well-dressed truly passed. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the careful choices, the meticulous details, and the silent messages conveyed by Victorian attire. Every button, every lace trim, every fold of fabric contributed to the grand performance of a tea party. It reminds us that history is not just about grand events, but about the intimate, personal rituals that shaped daily life, where even getting dressed was an act of social diplomacy. And now, perhaps, you'll have a newfound appreciation for the simplicity of throwing on your pajamas for your cup of tea. You've just navigated the complex world of Victorian dress codes for tea, understanding that every garment held a silent meaning. Now, let's move into the heart of the occasion itself. picturing the meticulous artistry involved in setting the tea table. This wasn't just about putting out cups. It was a precise, often elaborate arrangement designed to impress, facilitate conversation, and adhere to strict standards of elegance. Imagine yourself as a Victorian hostess, perhaps preparing for a particularly important afternoon tea. The drawing room table, often a low, elegant piece of furniture, becomes your canvas. Every item has its designated place, every detail considered, because the presentation of the table was a direct reflection of the hostess's good taste, social standing, and attention to detail. A poorly laid tea table was a social disaster waiting to happen. You wouldn't want to be known as the hostess with the slightly askew doily, would you? The very thought is enough to cause a mild Victorian fainting spell. First, the linens. A spotless, perfectly pressed tablecloth, often white damask or fine lace, was the foundation. Beneath it, a silence cloth might be placed to protect the table, absorb spills, and deaden the clatter of china, creating a more refined auditory experience. Then came the napkins, often folded into intricate shapes, a subtle display of domestic skill. Each napkin would be placed to the left of the tea plate, or sometimes directly on top of it. It was a symphony of pristine white, waiting for the colors of the food and porcelain to dance upon it. Next, the teaware. This was the star of the show. The centerpiece would be the teapot, often a beautiful ceramic or silver piece, gleaming brightly. Alongside it, a matching sugar bowl and a milk jug or creamer. Tea caddies, often decorative boxes for storing loose-leaf tea, might also be present, adding a touch of exoticism. Each teacup and saucer would be set out for every guest, typically with the handle of the cup pointing to the right, ready for easy grasping. A small tea plate would be placed in front of each setting, often with a matching teaspoon resting on the saucer. It was a meticulously arranged constellation of porcelain and silver. The arrangement of the teaware wasn't just aesthetic, it was functional. Everything had to be within easy reach, facilitating the smooth flow of the tea service. The teapot might be placed closer to the hostess, who typically poured the tea herself, a sign of her active participation and control over the ritual. Historians still argue whether the hostess always poured the tea, or if a senior servant occasionally took on the task in very grand households. Then came the delicious, delicate food. This was often arranged on tiered stands, elegant displays that allowed for a variety of treats without cluttering the table. The bottom tier typically held finger sandwiches, crustless, neatly cut triangles or rectangles, with fillings like cucumber, smoked salmon, or egg salad. The middle tier would often feature scones, light and fluffy, served with clotted cream and various jams. And the top tier was reserved for small cakes and pastries, miniature works of art. From delicate sponges to elaborate iced fancies, everything was bite-sized, designed to be eaten gracefully, without the need for cumbersome cutting or chewing. You wouldn't want to wrestle with a giant scone while trying to make polite conversation, would you? The crumbs alone would be a disaster. The cutlery, if any, was minimal. Small dessert forks or knives might be present for cakes, but generally, everything was designed to be eaten with fingers, hence finger food. This again emphasized neatness and refinement. You could practically hear the ghostly whispers of etiquette manuals. Remember, dear, a lady never takes more than 2 fingers to lift her sandwich. Finally, the decorative touches, a vase of fresh flowers, perhaps a few carefully placed doilies, or a small silver ornament could add to the charm. But over-decoration was frowned upon. The focus was on the teaware and the food, presented with understated elegance. It was about creating an atmosphere of refined comfort, not a cluttered exhibition. A quirky, fringe tidbit: sometimes the hostess would use small, decorative crumb sweepers, often miniature silver shovels, to discreetly clear any dropped crumbs from the tablecloth. This was a subtle, almost invisible act of maintaining perfection, without drawing undue attention to a guest's potential clumsiness. The act of setting the tea table was a performance in itself, a silent promise of the pleasant social interaction to come. It showcased the hostess's domestic skills, her adherence to social norms, and her commitment to providing a perfect experience for her guests. Every cup, every scone, every neatly folded napkin was a testament to the meticulous standards of Victorian society. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the shimmering porcelain, the crisp white linen, and the enticing array of delicate treats, all arranged with military precision. It reminds us that even the simplest pleasure, like a cup of tea, can be elevated into a profound social ritual where every detail matters, and every object has its place in the grand design of Victorian etiquette. And now, perhaps, you'll feel an urge to straighten your own imaginary teacup handle. You've just admired the meticulously set Victorian tea table, a silent symphony of porcelain and linen. Now, let's consider the orchestrator of this delicate performance, the hostess's imperative. In Victorian society, hosting a tea party was far more than just brewing tea. It was a daunting display of social prowess, domestic management, and subtle power. Imagine yourself as the hostess, perhaps a lady of the house, preparing for her afternoon tea. Weight of expectation rests lightly on your corseted shoulders. You are not merely providing refreshments, you are curating a social experience, navigating unspoken rules, and subtly reinforcing your position within the social hierarchy. A successful tea party could solidify your reputation, while a poorly managed one could lead to social whispers that lasted for weeks. You wouldn't want Aunt Mildred critiquing your choice of tea, would you? The very thought is enough to give one the vapors. One of the hostess's primary duties was to manage the guest list. This involved more than just deciding who to invite. It meant carefully considering social standings, existing relationships, and potential conflicts. You couldn't invite two ladies who were known rivals, for instance, without risking a frosty atmosphere. The hostess had to be a social strategist, ensuring a harmonious blend of personalities that would lead to polite yet engaging conversation. It was like playing a very subtle game of social chess where every move counted. Then came the preparation of the tea itself. While servants handled much of the heavy lifting, the hostess often took personal charge of the teapot. This wasn't just a practical task, it was a symbolic one. The hostess would often be seated closest to the tea tray, personally pouring for each guest, a gesture of hospitality and warmth. She would inquire about their preferences, milk and sugar, dear, and ensure each cup was perfectly brewed. This personal service elevated the ritual and showcased her domestic grace. It was a moment of quiet control, a gentle assertion of her authority over the proceedings. Historians still argue whether this was a universal practice, or if very grand households would delegate the pouring to a highly trusted senior servant. The hostess also had to ensure the quality of the provisions. The tea itself had to be of the finest blend, the sandwiches impeccably cut, the scones perfectly baked, and the cakes exquisitely presented. Any lapse in quality reflected directly on her. She would oversee the kitchen staff, ensuring everything was prepared to exacting standards. It was a constant exercise in quality control, long before the term existed. "Jenkins, are these cucumbers sliced thinly enough? I do declare, I can still see green." Beyond the physical preparations, the hostess was responsible for setting the tone of the conversation. She would introduce guests, gently steer discussions away from awkward topics, and ensure that everyone felt included, even the most timid guest. She had to be a master of polite inquiry and subtle redirection, a social conductor ensuring a harmonious conversational symphony. Imagine deftly changing the subject from a scandalous divorce to the beauty of hydrangeas. It required true finesse. A truly skilled hostess would also anticipate her guests' needs without being overtly solicitous. A subtle glance from across the room might prompt a servant to offer a fresh plate of sandwiches or to replenish a guest's teacup. It was a ballet of unspoken communication between the hostess and her domestic staff, an invisible network of service ensuring seamless hospitality. This was the mark of a truly accomplished lady, anticipating needs before they were even voiced. A quirky, fringe tidbit. Sometimes, hostesses would strategically place certain items on the tea table to spark conversation. A new book, an interesting botanical specimen, or a recently acquired piece of art could serve as a polite opening for discussion, allowing guests to engage without feeling forced. It was like having built-in icebreakers, disguised as elegant decor. "Oh, do tell, Mrs. Davies, have you read the latest volume of Lord Byron's poetry? It's simply scandalous." The hostess's power, though subtle, was immense. By inviting or excluding, by setting the tone, and by demonstrating impeccable taste, she could subtly affirm or challenge social positions. Her tea parties were miniature stages where social dramas played out, often without a single harsh word being uttered. Her quiet command over the environment ensured that the strict rules were adhered to, not through overt enforcement, but through the sheer weight of expectation and the desire of guests to conform. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the Victorian hostess, composed and elegant, yet subtly in command of her domain. Her tea party was a testament to her skill, her taste, and her quiet authority. It reminds us that even in an era of strict gender roles, women found powerful ways to exert influence and shape the social landscape, one perfectly poured cup of tea at a time. And now, perhaps, you'll have a newfound respect for anyone brave enough to host a gathering. You've just gained an appreciation for the intricate duties and subtle power of the Victorian hostess. Now, let's turn our attention to the very heart of the ritual itself: tea pouring etiquette. This wasn't merely about filling a cup. It was a refined, almost ritualistic act with unspoken rules that, if broken, could reveal a guest's lack of breeding or an unfortunate lapse in manners. Imagine you are a guest seated at a beautifully appointed Victorian tea table, the hostess poised gracefully by the teapot. The moment she begins to pour, a silent ballet of expectations commences. Your role as a guest is to receive the tea with equal grace and precision. Every movement, from the offering of the cup to the stirring of the sugar, was observed and judged. You wouldn't want to slurp your tea, would you? The very thought is enough to make a proper Victorian lady shudder. The hostess, having taken her position by the tea tray, would typically offer each guest their tea personally. She would ask, "How do you take your tea, or milk and sugar?" This was your cue to state your preference, clearly and concisely. No lengthy explanations, no indecision. A simple milk, please, or 2 sugars, thank you. Hesitation or changing your mind was considered a mild inconvenience. When receiving the cup, proper etiquette dictated that you should never, ever, hook your finger through the handle of the teacup. Instead, you were meant to hold the cup by pinching the handle between your thumb and forefinger, with your middle finger supporting the bottom of the handle. The other 2 fingers, the ring finger and pinky, were to remain gently curled, never splayed outwards. This specific grip ensured elegance and prevented an unsightly display of digits. It was a subtle test of manual dexterity, disguised as a polite gesture. You can almost hear the ghostly admonition, "Pinky in, darling, pinky in." Once the tea, milk, and sugar were in the cup, the act of stirring had its own set of rules. The teaspoon was to be stirred gently, in a back and forth motion, never in circles, and certainly never clanking against the sides of the teacup. The goal was to dissolve the sugar quietly and efficiently. Once stirred, the spoon was to be placed gently on the saucer, behind the cup, never left in the cup itself. Leaving the spoon in the cup was not only bad manners, but could also lead to unfortunate spills. Imagine trying to sip your tea with a spoon poking you in the eye. Dreadful. Now for the ultimate test. Sipping the tea. Tea was to be sipped quietly, never slurped. Small, delicate sips were preferred. The entire cup was not meant to be drained quickly. A tea party was a leisurely affair, and hurrying through your tea suggested you were either unrefined or eager to leave. And absolutely, under no circumstances, was it acceptable to blow on your tea to cool it. If it was too hot, you simply waited patiently. Patience, after all, was a Victorian virtue. You simply had to endure the heat like a true stoic, or risk being forever labeled as that person who blew on their tea. In reality, a properly educated Victorian gentleperson kept all fingers gently curved, including the pinky, to maintain an elegant and controlled grip. Splaying the pinky out was actually considered vulgar or a sign of being overly affected. So, if you're trying to be historically accurate, keep that pinky in. The placement of the teacup and saucer was also important. When seated at a low tea table, the saucer would remain on the table. When standing or mingling, however, both the cup and saucer would be held together in one hand, often the left, leaving the right hand free for shaking hands or holding polite conversation. It required a delicate balance, particularly if one was also juggling a small plate of sandwiches. It was a constant exercise in graceful multitasking. Historians still argue about the precise origins of some of these minute tea etiquette rules. Were they truly ancient traditions, or were many of them codified and emphasized during the Victorian era itself, as a way to create a clear distinction between social classes and reinforce an ideal of refined behavior? It's likely a bit of both, a blend of evolving customs and deliberate social engineering. The strictness of these rules, while seemingly trivial, served a larger purpose. They acted as silent social indicators, allowing Victorians to quickly assess a person's background, education, and understanding of polite society. To master tea etiquette was to demonstrate one's belonging, one's refinement, and one's adherence to the unspoken laws of polite society. It was a subtle filter, ensuring that only the most well-mannered could truly navigate the labyrinth of Victorian social life. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the quiet grace of the tea-pouring ritual, the subtle clink of porcelain, and the unspoken rules that guided every hand and every sip. It reminds us that even the simplest act, when elevated to a social ritual, and now, perhaps, you'll feel a newfound respect for the patience required to simply drink a cup of tea, Victorian style. You've just mastered the incredibly delicate art of tea pouring and sipping, understanding that every movement was scrutinized. Now, let's turn our attention from the beverage to the bites, exploring the precise and often anxiety-inducing scone and sandwich. Secrets for eating finger foods without a single social blunder at a Victorian tea party. Because in this world of meticulous manners, even a crumb out of place could speak volumes. Imagine you're sitting at the tea table, having successfully navigated the tea pouring. Before you arrayed on elegant tiered stands are the tempting treats. This is where many a novice could stumble. The goal was to eat gracefully, discreetly, and without drawing any undue attention to your consumption. You wouldn't want to look like you hadn't eaten in weeks, would you? The horror. First, the finger sandwiches. These were intentionally made small, crusts removed, fillings neatly contained, cut into perfect triangles or rectangles, precisely so they could be eaten in 1 or 2 delicate bites. The rule was simple. Use your fingers only. Never, ever use a knife and fork for a finger sandwich. That would be an egregious error, implying that the sandwich was too large, or that you lacked the dexterity to handle it gracefully. Pick it up neatly, bring it to your mouth, and consume it with minimal fuss. No stuffing your face, no open-mouthed chewing, and certainly no crumbs falling onto your pristine dress or waistcoat. It was a quiet ballet of dainty bites. You can almost hear the ghostly whispers. Remember, dear, chew with your mouth closed, and for goodness sake, no smacking. Next, the mighty scone. This seemingly innocent baked good was actually a minefield of etiquette. The most crucial rule: never slice a scone with a knife horizontally like a sandwich roll. This was a cardinal sin. Instead, a scone should be gently broken apart by hand, either in half or into smaller, manageable pieces. The goal was a natural, rustic break, not a precise cut. It was about embracing the scone's inherent crumbly nature, not fighting it. Once broken, then came the delicate dance of clotted cream and jam. The cream was applied first, followed by the jam, in that specific order. A small amount of each would be taken from the serving dish using the appropriate serving spoon and transferred to your own tea plate. Then, a small dollop would be applied to the piece of scone you were about to eat just before you ate it. Never pre-assemble an entire scone. It was a continuous, bite-bite construction. Imagine dipping a tiny dollop of jam onto your scone, carefully, precisely. It was less about eating and more about tiny, edible architecture. Historians still argue about the precise regional variations of cream first versus jam first. But for general Victorian etiquette, cream first was often the prescribed method for formal settings. And for the act of eating the scone, it was, again, small bites, no gobbling, no crumbs. The challenge was to manage the crumbly texture of the scone, the sticky jam, and the soft cream, all while maintaining an air of effortless grace. It truly required a delicate touch, It was like trying to eat a cloud, politely. Finally, the small cakes and pastries. These too were designed for easy consumption. If they were very small, like petit fours, they would be eaten with fingers. Larger, more elaborate cakes might warrant a small dessert fork, but discretion was key. The focus was on neatness, preventing any unsightly smears of icing or cream. You wouldn't want to look like you'd just had a wrestling match with a Victoria sponge, would you? Utterly unladylike. A quirky, fringe tidbit. It was considered rude to take the last item from a serving plate without being explicitly offered it by the hostess. This was known as the last piece rule. A guest might discreetly glance at the last sandwich, but would wait for the hostess to say, "Do have the last one, dear." This prevented any appearance of greediness or lack of consideration for others. It was a subtle test of your self-restraint. Oh no, I couldn't possibly. Well, if you insist. The entire ritual of eating at a tea party was a display of controlled behavior, a performance of refinement. It was about demonstrating that you were civilized, well-bred, and capable of navigating social situations with ease and elegance. Every carefully selected bite, every gentle placement of a spoon, every discreet chew was a silent affirmation of your understanding of the intricate rules of Victorian society. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the delicate dance of fingers and food, the unspoken rules governing every bite, and the quiet tension of maintaining perfect composure. It reminds us that even the seemingly simple act of eating could be a complex social challenge in Victorian times. And now, perhaps, you'll appreciate the freedom of enjoying your next scone with reckless abandon, crumbling it to your heart's content. You've just gracefully navigated the intricate, edible landscape of Victorian tea party food, mastering the delicate art of the scone and sandwich. Now, let's engage in the most subtle and often perilous part of the gathering: conversation's delicate dance. In Victorian society, what you said, how you said it, and even what you didn't say were all governed by strict, unspoken rules. Imagine yourself, a guest, at a Victorian tea, surrounded by elegantly dressed ladies and gentlemen, the air filled with the gentle clink of china. The conversation isn't a free-for-all, it's a carefully choreographed performance. A polite exchange of pleasantries, gossip, and subtly coded messages. The goal was to be engaging without being boisterous, witty without being rude, and informed without being pedantic. You wouldn't want to accidentally bring up a scandalous topic, would you? The very thought is enough to make the cucumber sandwiches go stale. The most mainstream historical fact about Victorian conversation at tea parties is the emphasis on polite topics. Safe subjects included the weather, recent travels, art, literature, music, and perhaps some light social news or local events. Discussions about fashion were acceptable among ladies, but gentlemen were expected to show a polite but not overly enthusiastic interest. The aim was to maintain a light, agreeable atmosphere, suitable for a relaxed afternoon. It was like a perpetual game of conversational dodgeball, where the scandalous topics were the balls you absolutely had to avoid. Conversely, certain topics were strictly taboo. Politics, religion, money, personal health complaints, and any form of scandal or gossip that was too direct were considered utterly vulgar. While gossip certainly circulated, it was done subtly through veiled remarks, raised eyebrows, and knowing glances, never through direct accusation or salacious detail. Complaining about your ailments was a definite no-no. No one wanted to hear about your gout over their Earl Grey. It was about projecting an image of serene well-being, even if you were secretly suffering from a terrible headache. Oh, the weather is quite bracing today, isn't it? The art of polite inquiry was also paramount. When asking questions, they should be open-ended enough to invite a response, but not so probing as to seem intrusive. Have you found the new season's fashions to your liking, Mrs. Finch? Was acceptable? How much did your husband pay for that hideous bonnet? Was absolutely not. It was a constant exercise in subtle curiosity without venturing into outright nosiness. A quirky fringe tidbit involves the use of fan language or flower language. While perhaps more prominent in earlier periods or in romantic contexts, a subtle version persisted in social gatherings. The way a lady held or manipulated her fan could convey unspoken messages. Similarly, sending or receiving certain flowers before or after a tea party could carry coded meanings, expressing admiration, disapproval, or other sentiments, all without a single direct word. It was like a secret, floral telegraph system operating beneath the surface of polite conversation. Imagine someone communicating "you are quite tiresome" by holding their fan in a specific way. The passive aggression was simply exquisite. The duration of a conversational turn was also important. You shouldn't monopolize the conversation, but nor should you be entirely silent. A good guest contributed to the flow, listened attentively, and offered appropriate interjections. Overly long anecdotes, boasting, or constant self-reference were all considered tiresome. It was a balance, a delicate equilibrium of speaking and listening, designed to keep the conversational ball gently rolling. You wanted to be seen as engaging, not as a windbag. Historians still argue whether the strictness of these conversational rules led to genuine suppression of thought or simply fostered a particular style of communication, emphasizing decorum and wit over directness. Some argue it created a superficial society, while others suggest it encouraged a more nuanced, subtle form of social interaction. Perhaps it varied greatly between different social circles and levels of intimacy. Silence, too, had its place. Brief, comfortable pauses were acceptable, allowing guests to sip their tea or enjoy their food. However, awkward, prolonged silences were a hostess's nightmare, indicating a failure to facilitate engagement. A skilled hostess would smoothly bridge such gaps with a new question or observation. It was a constant, subtle effort to maintain the illusion of effortless social harmony. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, envision the delicate dance of Victorian conversation, where every word was chosen with care, every topic carefully vetted, and every silence potentially laden with meaning. It reminds us that social interactions, even those as seemingly innocent as a tea party, can be complex performances governed by unseen rules. And now, perhaps, you'll appreciate the delightful chaos of your own modern conversations, where a stray political remark won't necessarily lead to social ostracization. You've just navigated the intricate linguistic landscape of Victorian tea party conversation, a delicate dance of polite topics and subtle fan language. Now, let's explore the flip side of that meticulous etiquette, the awkward guest, and identify common social blunders, along with how Victorians, with their emphasis on decorum, typically reacted to them. Because even with all those rules, someone was bound to slip up. Imagine yourself as a Victorian hostess, watching your carefully curated tea party unfold. Everything is going smoothly. The conversation is flowing. The cucumber sandwiches are being consumed with appropriate delicacy. Then, suddenly, a guest commits a social faux pas. It's like a tiny ripple in a perfectly calm pond, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but a glaring disruption to the discerning Victorian observer. You wouldn't want to be that guest, would you? The one who forever lives in infamy for their ill-mannered scone consumption. One of the most common, and perhaps most easily committed blunders, was improper eating etiquette. We've covered the rules for scones and sandwiches, but imagine someone cutting their scone with a knife, or, heaven forbid, licking jam off their fingers. Perhaps a guest might take too large a bite, leading to awkward chewing or gasp, even talking with a full mouth. These seemingly minor acts were considered highly uncouth, revealing a lack of refinement and self-control. The reaction would likely be subtle: a raised eyebrow, a fleeting glance between other guests, or a discreet sniff from an older, more established lady. It was all about the unspoken judgment. Did you see poor Mrs. Higgins? She slurped her tea. Dreadful, simply dreadful. Another major faux pas was monopolizing the conversation or introducing inappropriate topics. As we discussed, politics, religion, and personal complaints were strictly off-limits. A guest who droned on about their ailments, expressed strong political opinions, or launched into a detailed account of a recent financial misfortune would quickly be deemed tedious or vulgar. The hostess would attempt to gently redirect the conversation, perhaps with a polite cough or a new, safe question directed at another guest. If that failed, other guests might simply turn away, engaging in separate conversations, leaving the offender isolated in their conversational bubble. It was the ancient equivalent of being muted in a group chat, but in real life, and much more awkward. Inappropriate dress was also a significant blunder. Showing up in overly casual attire for a formal afternoon tea, or, conversely, appearing in dazzling evening wear, would mark a guest as socially clueless. It demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the event's nature and disrespect for the hostess. The hostess might offer a strained smile, while other guests would simply gaze pointedly at the offending garment, perhaps exchanging silent, disapproving glances. It was a sartorial whisper network, signaling they just don't get it. Bringing an uninvited guest was perhaps one of the gravest social sins. Victorian tea parties were often carefully curated gatherings. Arriving with an unexpected companion was a direct insult to the hostess, disrupting her meticulous planning and potentially upsetting the delicate social balance of the room. The hostess would be forced into an awkward position, potentially having to find an extra tea set or rearrange seating. The reaction here would be less subtle. A hostess might look visibly flustered or offer a cool, terse greeting to the interloper. It was a social explosion in miniature. Oh dear. You brought ... Bartholomew. How ... unexpected. A quirky, fringe tidbit, or to engage in overly familiar conversation. Maintaining a respectful distance, both physically and verbally, was crucial. A gentleman who leaned in too closely or whispered too intimately might find himself subtly shunned by the ladies present, their fans perhaps fluttering a disapproving rhythm. It was a silent, graceful enforcement of personal boundaries. Being overly loud or boisterous was also unacceptable. Victorian drawing rooms were places of subdued conversation and gentle laughter, not raucous revelry. A guest who spoke too loudly, laughed too heartily, or gestured too wildly would be seen as unrefined and disruptive. The prevailing reaction would be a collective lowering of voices, perhaps a subtle shushing from a servant, or an almost imperceptible tightening of facial expressions. Historians still argue whether some of these rules were primarily enforced by social pressure, or if genuine social ostracization could result from repeated infractions. It likely depended on the severity of the blunder and the social standing of the offender. Ultimately, the reaction to an awkward guest was rarely an open confrontation. Victorians prided themselves on their politeness and self-control. Instead, the disapproval would be communicated through subtle cues, a coolness in the voice, a stiffening of posture, a momentary pause in conversation, or the aforementioned knowing glances. The punishment was not an outright reprimand, but a silent, chilling social freeze-out, leaving the awkward guest acutely aware of their misstep without a single harsh word being uttered. It was social warfare, fought with polite smiles and barely perceptible snubs. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, picture these subtle dramas playing out in elegant Victorian drawing rooms. The awkward guest, blissfully unaware or painfully conscious of their blunder, and the polite society around them, silently judging. It reminds us that even in the most seemingly genteel of settings, human interaction is a complex performance, filled with hidden pitfalls and unspoken rules. And now, perhaps, you'll feel a newfound appreciation for simply enjoying your tea without fear of immediate social ruin. You've just winced at the various social blunders of the awkward Victorian tea party guest, recognizing the subtle punishments doled out. Now, let's expand our horizons beyond the drawing room and explore tea beyond the parlor, delving into the diverse variations of tea parties that blossomed throughout the Victorian era. From charming garden gatherings to the more substantial high tea, because tea, like society, found many ways to express itself. Imagine a warm summer afternoon, a gentle breeze rustling through rose bushes, and the distant sound of polite laughter. This isn't just an indoor affair. Tea often moved outdoors. Garden tea parties were a delightful variation, particularly popular in fine weather. These were generally less formal than their indoor counterparts, allowing for more relaxed conversation and movement. Guests might stroll through manicured lawns, admire flower beds, and enjoy their tea amidst the beauty of nature. The dress code might be slightly less rigid, with lighter fabrics and broader hats for sun protection. Serving would often involve larger, more robust teapots, and perhaps less delicate china to withstand the elements. It was a breath of fresh air, literally, for Victorian socialites. You wouldn't want your delicate porcelain teacup to be blown away by a rogue gust of wind, would you? Dreadfully inconvenient. Another significant variation was the tea reception, or at home. These were larger, more informal gatherings, often held to receive a large number of callers over a designated period. Unlike a sit-down tea party, where every guest had a specific place, a tea reception involved guests mingling, standing, and interacting in a more fluid manner. Tea would be served buffet-style from a large table, and refreshments would be more abundant, allowing guests to serve themselves. It was less about intimate conversation and more about seeing and being seen, circulating, and paying respects to the hostess. Think of it as a Victorian networking event, but with more doilies and less aggressive handshake. Historians still argue about the precise degree of informality allowed at these receptions, as they could range from relatively casual to quite grand affairs, depending on the hostess's social standing. Then there was the often confused concept of high tea. As we touched upon in Section 2, while afternoon tea was a light meal served on low tables in the drawing room, high tea originated as a more substantial evening meal for working-class and lower-middle-class families. It was typically served at a high dining table and included heartier fare, cold meats, cheese, bread, butter, pickles, salads, and sometimes even pies or hot dishes, in addition to tea. It was a practical, filling meal after a day of work, rather than a purely social indulgence. As the Victorian era progressed, some upper-class households adopted elements of high tea for family meals or less formal gatherings, blurring the lines a bit, but its roots were firmly in the working home, a testament to its practical utility. It was less about delicate finger sandwiches and more about, "I'm starving, give me meat and potatoes, and tea, of course." Another fascinating variation was the 5 o'clock tea, which was simply a formal afternoon tea held at the specific time of 5 p.m. This designated time gave it a certain cachet and implied a slightly more rigid adherence to social convention. It was often followed by an early dinner or engagement, making it a pivotal social stop in the late afternoon. It allowed for a very precise and predictable social schedule. You wouldn't want to be late for 5 o'clock tea, would you? That would be dreadfully inconsiderate. The sheer variety of these tea gatherings speaks to the adaptability of the tea ritual within Victorian society. It could be tailored to different social classes, different occasions, and different levels of formality, yet always retaining its core elements of tea, light refreshments, and polite conversation. It showcased the Victorians' ability to imbue even everyday activities with intricate layers of social meaning and expectation. A quirky, fringe tidbit in some very grand households. Specialized tea rooms might be designed distinct from the main drawing room, specifically for the purpose of hosting tea. These rooms would often be decorated in a lighter, more informal style, perhaps with botanical themes or chintz fabrics, creating a dedicated space for this beloved ritual. It was like having a dedicated tea cave, but much more elegant and less likely to have stale biscuits. So, as you gently drift deeper into relaxation, imagine the diverse settings for Victorian tea, from manicured gardens to bustling receptions, from intimate parlors to practical dining tables. Each offered a unique experience, yet all revolved around that comforting, civilizing beverage. It reminds us that even rigid societies found ways to vary their rituals, adapting to different needs and desires, ensuring that tea, in all its forms, remained a central and cherished part of Victorian life. And now, perhaps, you'll envision your next cup of tea not just as a drink, but as a journey through a world of fascinating social variations. You've just explored the diverse settings of Victorian tea, from sun-drenched gardens to bustling reception rooms. Now, let's pull back the elegant curtain and acknowledge the often invisible hands that made these elaborate gatherings possible. The servant's silent role, because behind every perfectly brewed cup and every impeccably arranged scone lay a vast, unseen network of meticulous labor. Imagine a grand Victorian household brimming with activity long before the first guest arrived for tea, while the hostess was busy with her guest list and conversational planning. An army of domestic staff was orchestrating the physical realities of the event, Their work was designed to be seamless, efficient, and, above all, invisible, ensuring the illusion of effortless elegance for the upper classes. You wouldn't want to see the butler sweating, would you? That would simply ruin the ambience. At the top of the servant hierarchy, involved in tea, would be the butler, or the parlor maid. The butler was responsible for overseeing the entire service, from ensuring the silver was gleaming to directing other staff. The parlor maid, often a senior female servant, would be directly involved in setting the table, arranging the tea equipage, and serving guests. Their movements had to be precise, quiet, and unobtrusive. Imagine a spectral presence gliding through the room, anticipating needs before they were even articulated. It was a masterclass in silent efficiency. Below them were the housemaids, responsible for the immaculate cleanliness of the drawing room. Before tea, they would have dusted every surface, polished every piece of furniture, and ensured the curtains hung perfectly. Every cushion would be plumped, every rug straightened. The room had to be pristine, a perfect stage for the social drama about to unfold. A single speck of dust was a moral failing, apparently. In the kitchen, the cook and kitchen maids would be a whirlwind of activity, preparing the delicate sandwiches, baking the light-as-air scones, and crafting the array of small cakes and pastries. This required precision, skill, and often long hours. The crusts of sandwiches had to be perfectly removed, the cucumber slices impossibly thin, the scones baked to a precise golden hue. It was less cooking and more culinary architecture, all against the clock. You can almost hear the harried cook muttering, "If one more scone collapses, I swear I'm going to throw this rolling pin at the master." The footmen, if the household was grand enough to employ them, played a visible yet silent role during the tea party itself. They might open doors for arriving guests, take coats and hats, and discreetly offer additional refreshments as directed by the hostess or butler. Their posture had to be erect, their expressions neutral, their movements quiet and graceful. They were essentially living, breathing, impeccably dressed props, designed to enhance the sense of luxury and service. It was like a silent, disciplined ballet, performed entirely for the guests' comfort. The sheer volume of tasks involved in a single tea party was immense. Preparing the tea itself, boiling water to a precise temperature, warming the teapot, setting out the elaborate tea service, polishing silver, preparing and plating food, cleaning up afterwards, and laundering delicate linens. This was a constant cycle of labor, often starting hours before the guests arrive and continuing long after they departed. Historians still argue about the precise hours worked by Victorian servants and the conditions they endured. But it's clear their lives were far from the leisurely elegance of their employers. A quirky fringe tidbit: some very particular hostesses would insist that the water for the tea be boiled in a special, small kettle in the drawing room itself, over a spirit lamp, to ensure it was absolutely boiling when poured into the teapot. This wasn't just about freshness. It was a display of meticulous attention to detail and a subtle flex of having staff dedicated to such a precise task. Imagine the parlor maid nervously tending a small flame, hoping it didn't scorch the valuable rug. The pressure. The ultimate goal of the servants was to create an illusion of effortlessness. Guests were never meant to see the toil, the spills, the hurried preparations, or the exhausted faces. The service was meant to appear as if it simply happened, flowing magically and smoothly. This invisibility of labor was a hallmark of Victorian upper-class domestic life. ensuring that the polite veneer of society remained unblemished by the realities of work. It was a silent, unsung ballet of service, performed perfectly, day after day. So, as you slowly drift deeper into relaxation, acknowledge the silent, diligent figures who moved through the background of every Victorian tea party. Their unseen efforts, their meticulous attention to detail, and their tireless labor were the true foundation upon which the elegant social rituals of the era were built. It reminds us that history is not just about the celebrated figures, but about the countless individuals whose quiet work made their world function. And now, perhaps, you'll feel a newfound appreciation for simply putting your own tea bag in a mug. You've just gained an appreciation for the silent, tireless work of the Victorian servants who made tea parties possible. Now, let's consider the smallest, often most scrutinized attendees at these gatherings: children at tea. Because even for the young, Victorian tea parties came with a surprisingly strict set of rules and expectations designed to mold them into polite, well-behaved members of society. Imagine yourself as a Victorian child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, invited to an afternoon tea party. This wasn't a play date. This was an early education in social decorum, a rigorous training ground for future societal participation. The pressure was immense. One wrong move, one loud giggle, one spilled cup, and you could bring shame upon your entire family. You wouldn't want to be sent to bed without your scone, would you? The very thought is enough to strike fear into the heart of any Victorian youngster. The most mainstream historical fact about children at Victorian tea parties is that they were expected to be seen and not heard. This adage was taken very seriously. Children were to sit quietly, observe, and speak only when directly addressed, and then only with polite, concise answers. Loud chatter, fidgeting, interrupting adults, or running about the room were absolute cardinal sins. Their presence was meant to be a testament to their parents' excellent upbringing, not a disruption. It was like being a tiny, well-dressed, silent statue that occasionally whispered yes, please, or no, thank you. Their manners at the table were meticulously drilled. They were taught to use the correct cutlery, to take small bites, to chew with their mouths closed, and to avoid making any noise while eating. Spilling food or drink was a major offense, resulting in stern looks or quiet, immediate removal from the table. The pinky rule for holding the teacup applied to them just as it did to adults. They were miniature adults in training, expected to perform perfectly. Imagine a tiny hand, trembling slightly, trying to hold that delicate teacup just so, under the watchful eyes of formidable ants. Children were typically served very weak tea, often heavily diluted with milk and sweetened with plenty of sugar. Sometimes, they might be given hot chocolate or milk instead, especially if they were very young. The idea wasn't to caffeinate them, but to include them in the ritual and habituate them to the social customs surrounding tea. They might also be given a limited selection of the lighter refreshments, like plain bread and butter or a simple biscuit, before being allowed more tempting cakes. It was a controlled introduction to the delights of the tea table. Yes, dear, you may have one small square of plain bread and no sticky fingers. A crucial aspect of their presence was learning through observation. Children were meant to absorb the nuances of adult conversation, the subtle cues of social interaction, and the unspoken rules of etiquette by watching their elders. They were apprentices in the art of Victorian polite society, and the tea party was a prime classroom. It was a passive form of education, where every elegant gesture and polite phrase was a lesson. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of such rigid expectations on Victorian children, and whether it fostered genuine politeness or merely suppressed natural childhood exuberance. A quirky, fringe tidbit: sometimes children at tea parties would have designated very small chairs, often placed slightly apart from the main adult seating, allowing them to participate visually without being too central to the adult conversation. This subtle seating arrangement reinforced their seen but not heard status, creating a mini social bubble for the youngsters. It was like having a special, tiny, polite person zone. Children were also taught the importance of proper greetings and farewells. They would be coached to offer a polite curtsy or bow upon arrival and departure, and to thank the hostess sincerely. Any display of shyness, awkwardness, or reluctance was a cause for parental embarrassment. They were little ambassadors of their family's respectability, and their performance was a direct reflection on their parents. The pressure on children at tea parties highlights the Victorian emphasis on character development and social discipline from a very young age. It was believed that instilling strict manners early on would lead to well-adjusted, respectable adults capable of navigating the complexities of their class-conscious society. The tea party, therefore, was not just a social event. It was a character-building exercise, one spoonful of diluted tea at a time. So, as you gently drift deeper into relaxation, envision these tiny, impeccably dressed figures perched on the edge of their seats, silently absorbing the intricate world of Victorian etiquette, and the belief that social grace was a skill to be diligently taught. It reminds us that even childhood had its strict rules, ensuring that politeness was woven into the very fabric of Victorian life from the earliest age. And now, perhaps, you'll appreciate the simple freedom of letting out a big yawn, no matter how impolite. You've just observed the miniature models of propriety, Victorian children at tea, meticulously adhering to their strict rules. Now, as our elegant gathering draws to a close, let's master the final, crucial act of social grace: departure etiquette. Because leaving a Victorian tea party was just as choreographed and laden with unspoken rules as arriving, ensuring a graceful exit without causing offense or appearing overly eager. Imagine the clock nearing the appointed end of the tea party, typically an hour or two after it began. A proper Victorian guest did not simply stand up and walk out. Oh no, that would be incredibly rude, akin to slamming the door on your way out. Instead, the departure was a subtle, almost imperceptible process, initiated by the guest but guided by the hostess's cues. You wouldn't want to be perceived as running away, would you? The thought is utterly mortifying. The first and most important rule was never to overstay your welcome. Guests were expected to leave within a reasonable time frame, usually indicating the end of the designated at-home hours, or shortly after the tea service began to wind down. Lingering too long was a sign of bad manners, suggesting you had nothing better to do or were imposing on the hostess's time. It was a delicate balance. Stay long enough to show appreciation, but not so long as to become a burden. You could almost feel the hostess's silent sigh of relief as the last guest rose to leave. Oh, do they ever leave? My feet are aching in these tiny slippers. When it was time to depart, the guest would subtly catch the eye of the hostess, perhaps with a polite nod or a small, discreet smile. This was the nonverbal signal that you were preparing to make your exit. The hostess, in turn, might offer a polite, mild protest. "Oh, must you go already?" Which was almost always a rhetorical question, simply part of the polite ritual. You were, of course, expected to insist gently that you must, indeed, depart. It was a little performance of regret, even if you were secretly yearning for the comforts of home. The farewells themselves were conducted with grace and efficiency. A guest would make their way to the hostess first, offering a polite thank you for the hospitality. This would be a brief, warm exchange, expressing appreciation for the pleasant afternoon. Long, drawn-out farewells were frowned upon, as they could hold up the hostess and make other guests uncomfortable. It was a swift, courteous acknowledgement of her efforts. "Thank you so much for a truly delightful afternoon, Mrs. Cavendish." The tea was simply divine, and the conversation utterly sparkling. After thanking the hostess, guests would then offer polite goodbyes to the other attendees they had conversed with, or to those they were specifically acquainted with. This would involve a simple nod, a brief handshake for gentlemen, or a polite curtsy for ladies. Extended conversations at the doorway were discouraged, as they could create a bottleneck and interrupt other guests' farewells. The goal was a smooth, unencumbered flow out of the drawing room and out the door. It was a perfectly orchestrated social egress, ensuring no one tripped over a trailing silk gown or a misplaced top hat, a quirky, fringe tidbit. Sometimes, if a guest had brought their own carriage, or if transportation arrangements were particularly complex, the servant attending the door might subtly communicate with the departing guest's driver or coachman. This ensured that the carriage was ready at the exact moment the guest stepped outside, minimizing any awkward waiting or fumbling for transportation. It was a ballet of silent coordination, ensuring a seamless transition from parlor to pavement. Imagine the horror of having your carriage not ready. The embarrassment would be unbearable. Another unspoken rule: never discuss your departure plans loudly with other guests within earshot of the hostess. This could be interpreted as signaling boredom or a desire to leave prematurely, which was disrespectful. All departures were to be handled discreetly, as a private exchange between the departing guest and the hostess. Historians still argue whether the perceived pressure to conform to such rigid departure rules truly stifled genuine social interaction, or simply enforced a disciplined sense of collective consideration. The final act of departure would be collected coats and hats from the servants in the hall. Once outside, guests might offer a polite nod or a brief good day to any other departing guests. But again, long conversations on the doorstep were avoided. The aim was to conclude the social engagement cleanly and efficiently, leaving a lasting impression of grace and propriety. So, as you gently drift deeper into relaxation, envision the quiet grace of a Victorian departure, a final flourish of etiquette that sealed the social success of the afternoon. It reminds us that every step of a Victorian tea party, from the first invitation to the final farewell, was part of an intricate dance, where politeness and precision reigned supreme. And now, perhaps, you'll feel a newfound freedom in simply waving goodbye after your next cup of tea. You've just executed a perfect Victorian departure, gracefully exiting the world of strict social rules. Now, as our journey through the surprisingly intricate world of Victorian tea parties draws to a gentle close, let's reflect on tea's enduring legacy. considering how these seemingly rigid rituals actually shaped many of the modern social customs we take for granted today. Imagine the quiet revolution brewed in those Victorian drawing rooms. What began as a duchess's afternoon snack blossomed into a social institution that influenced generations. Many of the polite habits we still observe, even casually, have their roots in this era. Think about inviting friends over for coffee or a casual brunch. The Victorian tea party laid the groundwork for structured, yet relaxed, home entertaining. It's like the great-grandparent of your casual Sunday get-together, but with far more starch and finger sandwiches. One of the most mainstream historical facts about tea's legacy is its profound impact on socialization outside of formal meals. Before afternoon tea became popular, structured social visits were often limited to formal dinners, balls, or calling hours that could be quite stiff. Afternoon tea provided a lighter, more frequent opportunity for men and women to interact in a respectable domestic setting. It normalized the idea of gathering purely for conversation and light refreshment, something we now do constantly, without a second thought. It truly broadened the scope of polite social interaction, moving beyond purely utilitarian meals. The emphasis on table manners and polite conversation from the Victorian Tea Party era also left a lasting mark. While we might not worry about the exact pinky position, the general principles of chewing with your mouth closed, not interrupting, and being a pleasant conversationalist can be traced back to the Victorian era's rigorous training in social graces. Many etiquette guides from that time became foundational texts for what was considered good manners for well over a century. So, the next time you silently judge someone for slurping their soup, you can thank a Victorian for that ingrained sense of propriety. Furthermore, the foods associated with tea became staples. Scones, cucumber sandwiches, and a variety of small cakes are still quintessential elements of many modern afternoon teas. Whether in fancy hotels or casual cafes, the tiered cake stand, an iconic symbol of afternoon tea, remains a popular and elegant way to present pastries. This culinary legacy continues to delight taste buds, even if the strict eating rules have loosened considerably. You can practically hear the collective sigh of relief from all the spoon lovers, who can now cut them horizontally without fear. The very concept of taking a break for tea or coffee during the workday or in the afternoon has roots in the Victorian tea habit. The Duchess of Bedford's original need for a mid-afternoon pick-me-up evolved into a widespread cultural practice of pausing for a restorative beverage. The modern coffee break or tea break is a direct descendant of this Victorian ritual, a moment to refresh and recharge before continuing with the day. It's a testament to the enduring power of a good brew to punctuate our lives. A quirky, fringe tidbit about its legacy. The Victorian emphasis on tea also inadvertently boosted the global economy and led to the massive expansion of tea plantations in various parts of the British Empire, particularly India and Ceylon. This created new industries, new trade routes, and transformed landscapes, all fueled by a thirst for that perfect cup of tea. So, your simple cuppa has a surprisingly vast imperial history behind it. It's like a tiny liquid empire in a mug. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which Victorian tea rituals were prescriptive for all social classes versus aspirational ideals. However, there's no doubt that the ideal of Victorian propriety, so strongly associated with the Tea Party, influenced public behavior and social expectations for decades to come, far beyond the strict confines of the upper-class drawing room. The notion of the drawing room itself, as a semi-public space for receiving guests and conducting polite social interactions, was heavily defined by the Tea Party. It became the quintessential space for respectable entertainment, a direct contrast to more public or rowdier forms of amusement. This concept of a refined, controlled social space still echoes in our ideas of formal entertaining at home. So, as you slowly drift into the quiet comfort of your own peaceful night, let the gentle clink of Victorian teacups echo softly in your mind. The surprising strictness of those rules wasn't just about rigidity. It was about creating a sense of order, beauty, and refined connection in a rapidly changing world. And in doing so, they left us with a legacy of manners, hospitality, and a comforting beverage that continues to soothe and connect us today. It reminds us that even the most elaborate social customs, over time, become the quiet, familiar background hum of our modern lives.